Bonjour, Particle Dreamers, it's Claire from integrallylife.com. Today, talking about change. The other day, I had a conversation with a fellow coach, and he has a client who knows he needs to change. He knows what he needs to change, but won't get motivated to do it. And so we had a long discussion about is knowledge, is knowing that you need to change enough to change, and awareness. So we'll talk about that in a moment, actually, the difference between knowledge and awareness. But my take on that in very shortly is that I don't think his client really knows what he needs to change. Or let me rephrase it. This man, I guess, knows here in the head intellectually. And intellectual knowledge, that's not enough for change in my experience and in my opinion. So that's the difference between maybe knowledge and awareness. And for me, awareness is an embodied experience. So when I refer to awareness in this podcast, I would refer to this, an embodied experience of what's happening. Not, oh, I know I should quit smoking or whatever the case is because, you know, my doctor says it and there are studies who say so. But this is a disembodied, there is me, and outside of me, there are these studies that say humans, when they smoke too much, they die, something like that. But the link is missing. Whereas when we develop an internal embodied experience, awareness, then the link is made. And maybe we don't even know about these studies, but we know that, well, keeping the same example, which wasn't the case for this client actually, but anyway, it's an easy example to grasp. We know if we wake up every morning and we cough and we feel tired and we notice that we cannot get up the stairs like we used to do, or things like that, that tells us something different. And that's where the motivation for change begins, not because someone else outside of us told us we need to change. And maybe that can be something we read or whatever. Actually, this example is good because this smoking, I heard about what I find a genius way of helping people who want to quit smoking. And it was something like mindful smoking or conscious smoking, something like that. And they said to the participants, you keep smoking, but you do it mindfully. I know you like it, so the next time you have a cigarette, really do it an embodied experience, like almost a meditative way of smoking. And they would guide them into taking the cigarette and feel it in between your fingers. And as you put it into your mouth and breathe, feel the smoke expand into your lungs and feel the smell of the smoke and so on. And they would be very adamant, don't quit smoking, don't stop. Don't even try to smoke less. Keep smoking, but with this mindfulness, awareness. And what happens is, of course, maybe it's not so straightforward for you, but unsurprisingly for me, people wanted to stop. So they were asking for it before the organizers of the group began to say, well, yeah, it's okay to smoke. They were like, no, you go on like you did before. And the beauty of this, the genius of that, is that they were getting them to this embodied awareness, this experience lived from within. And that's how this was I don't know if it's still going. I read that in an article, but I find this genius, and it was really effective. So that's my guess in that conversation with my fellow coach friend, that his client just knows intellectually but it doesn't have an embodied experience of, I want to change. This is something that he kind of, yeah, I know my life would be better, I know whatever, but there is no embodied experience. And that's how he lacks motivation. External motivation is not going to last and is not going to be as powerful as an internal experience. And I actually used the same principle with great results with mindful eating to change relationship with food for some of my clients who need that. And it always works. Let me give you another example, because one other point of the conversation was we need time to change. We cannot, especially if it's a long-term habit, if it's been a pattern in life for years and years, then we will need years to change that. And I don't think so. Again, awareness, embodied experience. So my next example is going to be a bit more intense, but it's someone I met. You probably know it by now. I was living on a sailing boat for some years. I met all sort of interesting people, lots of people who changed their life. And one in particular marked me with his story. This guy was from New York. And, you know, we all know, like, there is this life is now saying, and it's kind of a almost burst thing, and it's totally lost its power. It's like, yeah, life is now, live in the now. You could be done to die tomorrow. Yeah, doesn't have a lot of power except for a few people who faced death, and that's what happened to this man. His sister died suddenly in the attacks on the towers in 9/11. And from one day to the next, he realized this sentence that has lost its power over so many of us. For him, it became really real, just in a moment. It's not his death, but the death of his sister suddenly made him realize, yeah, I mean, she's dead, and I'm not sure she lived like the life she really wanted. And I'm sure that I'm not living the life I want, and I could be dead tomorrow like this. In a really short time, it completely changed his life. He decided he wanted to live the life he wanted. And the life he wanted was, for now at least, traveling on a sailing boat. So he bought a sailing boat, and that's how I ended meeting him in Las Palmas, Canarias. So change can happen really fast when we get to this embodied awareness. Now, how long do we need to get to this embodied awareness? It depends. If you know me, you know it's one of my two preferred answers. I don't know, and it depends. Yeah, it depends. Seeing someone die, I mean, having someone you really deeply care about die is a very strong experience, and probably is going to change you very fast, faster than another. But you can get to the same result by noticing, intentionally getting to this awareness. And it can be faster or slower depending on people and situations, but it can be very fast. And I really want to emphasize on that. It doesn't have to be fast. It's not always fast, but it can be. So for a long time, including myself, I had this belief that change needs time. And it's a limit that we don't need to have. It's not always true. So when we are talking about change, knowledge, intellectual knowledge, it's just like an interesting thought. And as interesting as we find it, as important maybe as we find it, it's rarely enough for real motivation to be there. So I believe to change really at least in a long-term way and an easier way, we need this embodied awareness, this embodied experience. And I'm not saying it's always enough to spark change, because the change might be more complex than that. Maybe we have some things we need to heal first. Like, I talk a lot about regulating the nervous system, for example. Well, gaining awareness while still having a hyperactivated nervous system can lead into stress, actually, because now we have this really embodied awareness that we need to change, but we are feeling helpless and hopeless because we have this hyperactivation, and maybe we are not even aware of that. And it's, when we have this pattern of I try, but I never get through it and I never change. And that's when we need people like me or my colleagues to help go through that, to gain this added awareness and make change possible and make it safe enough to try something new. But as far as motivation is concerned, then in my experience, embodied awareness, it beats everything, and it's surprisingly efficient because it's generative. And when you get to that moment, you don't need to focus so much on the actions because they just come out. Like the person I was referring to who changed his life, he didn't plan so much, oh, I'm going to buy this kind of boat. And he just had this very congruent thought of, I need to change my life. I need to do it now. And so he focused on these, and the rest just happened in some ways. I'm not saying he did not do anything and it's magical, and this kind of manifestation woo-woo. But there is a sense of magic, though, when we get to this level of clarity on what we want and what is happening, that gets us into action, that also get results and allows other actions and so on. And that's what I call generative. And that's what I call effortless action, which is the second pillar of my framework: relaxed energy, effortless action, meaningful connections. And it really pretty feels like magic when it's happening, but it starts with embodied awareness, experience. Embodied experience, embodied awareness. If you know permaculture, it's really like that. We focus on the conditions for the actions to rise. Like in permaculture, they focus on the soil and the ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, versus focusing on individual plants that needs to grow and maybe needs external outputs for it. So lots of energy for exactly the result we want. Well, in generative change and in generative action, we never know exactly what's going to come up, but we know it's going to be great because it's going in the direction we want. So now who do you know, and maybe that's you and maybe not, but who do you know who needs this distinction of motivation, of knowledge, intellectual knowledge, and external motivation versus internal motivation and generative action coming from an embodied experience and awareness? And how would you make them get the difference between those two, between knowing intellectually about the change they want to getting the embodied awareness about this change? How do you see that happening? And that's it for this week. Boom, life just got easier. Thanks for being here. I hope this was helpful. Tell me, drop your comments, drop any questions on Facebook, Instagram, my socials. I love these conversations. I tried this to be a conversation and not a monologue. So let me know. Let's keep it rolling. Subscribe to get more, of course. I will be there next week for another one. And spread the fierce love. Spread to anyone who needs to hear that right now. Stay tuned for the next video. And until then, enjoy the experience. Bye.